I assume everyone knows Scream, at least by sight, or even from the movies parodying it. The Ghostface mask is very famous. It is said that its creator based it on the story I'm going to tell you today and on Daniel Harold Rowling to create the legendary character. Let's take a deep look at the Gainesville Ripper case. And yes, this is a Twisted Minds. So, hello and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. Up there, on the eye that's on screen, you can see the rest of my cases. My social network links are below if you'd like to follow me. And without anything else to say, let's begin. It was August of 1990 in Gainesville, north of the state of Florida. Before the events, and even afterwards, up to this day, Gainesville is considered one of the best places to live in the entire state. Commonly very safe. It is a city where a large part of its population consists of university students from various parts of the country who settle there to study. At the University of Florida, in addition to being known for its university, it is recognized for preserving its classic architecture and the number of museums that exist there. However, the usual tranquility of Gainesville was interrupted by 3 days of attacks that terrified everyone. The first of the attacks occurred in the early hours of August 24th, 1990. Christina Powell hadn't been in touch with her mother all day, which would be normal if it weren't for the fact that she had just moved to college. And being away from home to start the semester, they communicated about every little thing. We're talking, moreover, about the early 90s, so there were no chats or text messages, at least not available to the average user. On the 25th, the situation escalated when they received no news from the young woman who was waiting for her sister and brother-in-law to bring a piece of furniture to her apartment. The next day, Christina's parents decided to make the trip to Gainesville, realizing that something strange was going on. Around 4 in the afternoon, the police arrived at Christina's apartment because her parents had made a request for a wellness check. The manager of the place was there and tried to open one of the doors with his key, but couldn't. The officers asked for permission to enter the apartment and looked for another way to get in. They went to a door that was on the 3rd floor of the property. Only then did they manage to do it. The problem was that as soon as they opened it, they were faced with an extremely strong smell, something that could not be ignored. There they found the body of a lifeless woman. But it wasn't Christina's, it was Sonia Larson's. Sonia was a friend and department mate of Christina's. She was also starting the semester at the university. She only had a shirt on, but her breasts were exposed. Multiple stab wounds could be seen on her arm, leg, and chest. In addition, her face was swollen, indicating she had taken a hard hit. The bed was covered in blood, but they couldn't stop there. The police had to search the rest of the house. So, going down a floor, they found the body of another woman in the living room next to the couch. That was indeed Christina Powell, the woman they came looking for. She had 5 stab wounds in her torso, and whoever had done this to her had also cut off her nipples. Between her knees, on a damp towel, there was an almost empty bottle of dish soap. The soap covered her vaginal area and left a layer of foam around her vulva. Both of them had been tied up with tape. Sonia had been taped at the mouth, but it wasn't there. At that moment, her killer had taken it off. This killer had turned the women's wallets inside out and thrown their contents on the floor. But the rest of the apartment seemed untouched. The doors were locked from the inside. The women's scars were normal. They weren't touched. Both were planning to get part-time jobs in order to study and were last seen on the 23rd of August at 11 o'clock at night. The double homicide was discovered on the 26th, but the next day, the 27th, they were discussing yet another murder. There was a third victim named Krista Hoyt in a similar situation. Krista hadn't contacted anyone all day and didn't show up for work. Her boss noticed the absence, which was very unusual, so he asked for an officer to go look for her. Krista was found in her apartment. Her headless body was on the bed. There was blood everywhere. After searching, it was quite easy to find the head, placed as if it were a trophy on a shelf, pretending to look at her body. Otherwise, the wounds were similar to those of Christina and Sonia. They even cut off her nipples and removed a piece of skin from her back. They also had taped her wrists, but the killer took them away. The biggest, or almost the only difference, was actually in a large cut he had from the pubic area to the chest, which exposed his intestines. 3 deaths in less than a week, deaths that resembled each other too much and became worse with each victim. The owner of the place had seen the gate of the house open on 2 different occasions. He had told Christina, as it seemed unusual to him, and she thought that someone like the phone technician may have forgotten to close it. The autopsies proved that the deaths were due to the number of stab wounds received. In addition, a liquid was discovered in Christina's vaginal area. The killer had tried to clean the evidence of sexual abuse. The news of a serial killer around the university campus became public after the second attack. That is, on the morning of August 26th, and as expected, it caused a state of panic throughout the city. The university suspended classes to prevent students from returning to their apartments and rooms alone at night. In addition to this official measure, the students, who rightly felt in danger, took their own measures. Thus, for example, whether it was night or day, no one walked alone in the city. As for their apartments, the students took turns sleeping and keeping watch, adding more locks and other forms of security so that no one could get in. The fear was so great that by the end of August, hundreds of students decided to leave Gainesville. And, in fact, it is estimated that approximately 700 never returned to finish their studies. Beyond the collective fear and the obvious patterns among the 3 attacks, the police really had nowhere to start investigating since no incriminating evidence had been left at any of the crime scenes. Before leaving, the killer removed the tape he had used to gag his victims to avoid leaving his fingerprints. In addition, he cleaned the bodies with different solvents, such as alcohol, to remove any traces of semen that could implicate him. There was then no kind of clue or evidence to guide the police towards a suspect, or at least towards a logical line of investigation. So the terror set in Gainesville permanently. The students not only took turns sleeping, but they had also started to arm themselves. They were sleeping, for example, with knives or other forms of defense. Security around the campus and university was reinforced for the following months. The police carried out stricter surveillance operations in the city. Unable to find any trace that would lead them to the Gainesville killer, the only thing they obtained during that time were some testimonies from neighbors who had seen other people in the vicinity. That week, a neighbor said he saw 2 black men walking towards Christina's apartment after midnight, the day she died. Another man passing by the area saw around the same time a white and blonde man. When he pointed him with the car lights, the man crouched behind a garbage container. He didn't let him see his face. Another neighbor also said they saw a white man with blonde hair at 10 o'clock at night. But none of these testimonies helped much. What did attract attention was what Christina's sister said. The woman's boyfriend had arrived in town with her on the 22nd of that month, which made him a person of interest. On the other hand, Sonia Larson's boyfriend or ex-boyfriend had left her a letter where he seemed upset by the young woman's decision to end the relationship. He was another suspect, but none of them were useful. Sonia and Christina's neighbors heard the shower in the apartment at 6:30 in the morning. Apparently, neither of them was the type of person who would be awake at that hour. Another neighbor heard the song Faith by George Michael playing loudly around 10 o'clock. According to the forensic examination, the women were already dead by that time, so that must have been the killer, taking his time to clean the scene and get organized. On the 28th of the same month, 2 more bodies were found, although this time one was male. We're talking about the murders of Manuel Taboada and Tracy Pauls, both 23 years old. The victims had been stabbed at their residence, although the one who received the most injuries was Manuel. So far, with the exception of Manuel, the victims all had several physical traits in common. All were brunette, young students, skinny. A pattern was being drawn that was easily identifiable. In this latest finding, the maintenance man of the complex had gone to the apartment at the request of one of the boys' friends. He opened the door and the first thing he saw was Tracy dead. Also, she had a bag by her side. He quickly locked the door, and when he got to the police just minutes later, the door was open and the bag had disappeared. Tracy assured her family she felt safe, believing her boyfriend's presence would protect her from harm. The strange thing about this scene was that it was not like the others. The level of attack on the bodies was not the same. Everything indicated that he had been interrupted in the act, but it could be assumed that he had to be the killer of the other women, since in the autopsy soap remains were shown in the vagina, again trying to eliminate all trace. Coincidences that perhaps had nothing to do with it are that the victims of the 3 locations died in waterbeds and that all the apartments had cats, which were not injured at any time and were in good condition when the police arrived at the houses. At this point, we have a clear serial killer with a modus operandi. There are behaviors that can be studied in order to find out what they would do next or what kind of person they were. That's why they called in criminal profilers to do the job of finding out a little more about this person. There were some persons of interest in the investigation, but none were convincing. First, we have Ed Humphrey. Humphrey was for a time the prime suspect, even though his fingerprints did not match what was found at the scene, which, anyway, wasn't much. The young man was 19 years old, had some anger issues, and had made hostile comments towards his then-girlfriend. The suspicions were more due to what people said about him and some of the things he had done, like threatening 2 students with a knife. On the 30th of August of that year, he was arrested for attempting to attack his grandmother. Then at another time, there was also the suspect, Stephen Bates, who was a muscular man with tattoos described as satanic all over his body. He had been arrested for the armed robbery of a woman, but what caught the eye was the large knife he used. During the interrogation, he said he had had a dream in which he cut off a woman's head and left it on a shelf looking at the bed while he raped her. Well, that was extremely disturbing, but it also matched what had happened to Krista. Honestly, the one who seemed most guilty was Humphrey. At the same time, he also seemed too confused. He claimed to have nothing to do with the murders, but referred to himself as John. And he said that a bad man had killed the 5 students and that this man was inside him. Let's expand on that. He was known for having a collection of knives and blades that he carried with him. Additionally, they knew that he had stopped taking his psychiatric medication, which could have been the reason for the attacks. Lastly, but not a minor detail, Ed had wounds on his face and arms. However, a review of the scant evidence left at the crime scene allowed to find a practically minuscule sample of semen through which Ed's DNA could be compared. The technology was not as effective as it is today. But even so, it allowed to determine that the sample found at the crime scenes corresponded to a B blood type. And Ed had a type A blood, so he was not the killer. The investigation remained at a standstill until November of that same year, 3 months after the murders, when Cindy Jurasich called the Gainesville police. Cindy lived in Louisiana, specifically in a place called Shreveport, where Daniel Rowling was from and whom she had met years before in church. Cindy always believed that Daniel was strange, that there was something off about him, and when she heard about what had happened in Gainesville, she immediately thought of this person. Daniel would always tell us that one day he would leave this town and go to a place where the girls are beautiful, and he could just lie in the sun and look at beautiful women all day. And while it's a statement that might match Florida and certainly made the investigators pay attention without a doubt, wasn't it the most accusatory statement or the one that caught their attention the most, but what Cindy said that Danny had told her husband, Stephen Doving. She used to come to the house at night a while back. Then one night Stephen came and asked me, does she have to leave now? When I asked him why, he told me he had a problem. So I wanted to find out what problem, and I asked Stephen directly, who told me that. Danny had told him that he liked to go through people with his knife. At the time, Cindy didn't believe Danny was capable of doing something like that. But since the news about the murders in Gainesville had been published, she couldn't stop thinking about it. And the investigators came to the same conclusion, at least it was worth looking into. In a dead-end alley and following the information from Cindy Jurasich had provided, the police decided to search in Shreveport, Daniels City. There they discovered a cold case, with many similarities to what had happened in Gainesville and which had also remained unsolved. The case had occurred the previous year on the 4th of November of 1989. 55-year-old William Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie Grissom, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean Grissom were murdered in the man's house. Detective Maines, leading the Gainesville case, reviewed the case files. From the investigation carried out by his colleagues from Shreveport, through these, he discovered that Julie's body had been positioned similarly to how the student killer had left his victims. In addition, she physically resembled the other murdered women. And they weren't the only similarities he found with the 3 attacks in his city. Residue of adhesive tape, vinegar, and soap had also been found on Julie's body. Elements that the killer used to clean the traces of himself that he might have left on his victims. Detective Maines immediately sent the fluids found on Julie's body to be compared with those that had been collected from the Gainesville crime scene evidence. They found that both matched. The blood type was another indicator. As we've already said, the technology wasn't terribly advanced, but at least it was known that the killer of the women in Florida had type B blood. And it turns out that Julie had been bitten on the breasts and evidence was left on them. Investigators found that her blood type was B, matching the killer's profile in all the cases. Police efforts focused on Danny, uncovering that he had several criminal records which suggested that he could have been responsible for a bank robbery in Gainesville, which had occurred on August 26, the day Krista Hoyt's lifeless body was discovered. In order to confirm the authorship of the robbery and hoping to find some more evidence, they analyzed what they had discovered about the event. The thief had left behind a weapon, a bag of money, and a cassette player with a recording tape that no one had listened to. On the tape, a man singing and talking could be heard. He talked about his life, his family, and even detailed the best way to hunt and kill a deer. The recording went on for hours, in which the man was heard singing nonsensical things about a mysterious killer, but it was of no use. However, at one point in the recording, this man said his name, Daniel Harold Rowling. Thus began his search, finding him not far from Gainesville, in Mariel County Jail, for a robbery committed 10 days after the last attack. Which would mean that in reality the murders would have continued had not someone caught him. His blood type was immediately analyzed, matching that of the killer. But who was he? Daniel Rowling? Daniel Harold Rowling was born on the 26th of May 1954 in Shreveport in the state of Louisiana, United States. Within the marriage of Claudia and James Rowling, a policeman from their city. Some sources claim he was a military veteran. As we always say in these types of cases, a violent upbringing does not diminish or excuse the crimes that individuals like Danny commit in their adulthood. But we must discuss the abuses he suffered in his early life. By the hands of his father, who always made it clear to Danny that he had neither been a wanted nor planned child. To give you an idea, the first time James hit his son was when he was just 1 year old, because according to him, Daniel wasn't crawling the way he was supposed to. Because it's perfectly clear that it's good upbringing to hit your baby when they're not crawling in the very specific way you want them to. Because obviously, they are going to understand. And as Daniel was growing up, the level of violence kept on escalating, becoming another factor in the scale of violence. When the couple had their second child, Kevin, whom his father abused in the same way he did with his older brother and his wife. Claudia tried several times to leave, even leaving the family home more than once. But all her attempts ended with her having to go back to her husband. Let's remember that during that time in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't very well viewed for a woman to get divorced. As expected, the violence they experienced at the hands of James Rowling affected both Danny and her mother and brother. For example, while still a child, Danny ran away from home several times to go camping in the forest. In an attempt to escape the abuses of her father, Claudia, her mother, began to develop solid tendencies, even trying to cross the bridge. When her eldest son was 11 years old, Claudia tried to cross the bridge, injuring herself. This suggested she spend some time in a psychiatric hospital. Up until that point, Dani had been finding refuge in art, spending a lot of her time playing various instruments or just listening to music. But the fact that her mother attempted that made her mental stability, already quite fragile, even more complicated. Music was no longer enough to quiet her mind, so she started leaning towards illicit substances. By age 14, Daniel had problematic alcohol and drug consumption, and his behavior was transforming to become progressively worse. At that age, his neighbors discovered him spying on their teenage daughter. Of course, upon finding out, his father ended up physically punishing him for the following months. During that time, and even the subsequent years, Daniel tried to control his impulses. To avoid doing again what he had done with his neighbor and simply spying on her or getting close to her or other girls. To control himself, Dani not only abused illicit substances but also started going to church, believing that it could help him. But with increasingly problematic consumption, his grades began to drop until he eventually dropped out of high school. He was then 16 years old. Although he tried to start working, he was unable to maintain a stable job, and that led him to enlist. His first choice was to join the Naval Force, but he was rejected, so he ended up becoming part of the Air Force. And while we don't have the exact dates he was part of the Army, we know that this period didn't last too long, as his performance as a soldier was also very poor. He continued to use various drugs in a problematic way. Shortly after joining the 72, he was discharged from the Air Force for possessing illicit substances. Refusing to return home to his abusive father, Dani went to live with his grandfather. That's when he met Omar Halko, whom he married on September 6th of 74 at the Shreveport Pentecostal Church when they were both 19 years old. However, getting married did not help improve his behavior. On the contrary, during the 4 years they were a couple. Omar was a victim of Daniel, who inflicted the same violence on her and her daughter as his father had exerted against him and his family. During those 4 years of marriage, Daniel held various jobs, none of which lasted very long. The most stable was a bar where he was for a couple of years before being fired. The reasons were always the same: fits of anger, violence, or showing up to work drunk. The economic instability coupled with the violence led to Omar divorcing Daniel in 76, taking their daughter with her. And while Dani wasn't particularly a good father, and much less a good husband, the separation caused him to fall into a severe depression in the following months. However, by the year 1977, his sadness turned into much darker feelings. Angered by being abandoned, he decided to get revenge, or rather, to vent his anger, by sexually abusing a woman who physically was very much like his ex-wife. He broke into this woman's house in the middle of the night, abused her, and left her there as his first victim, but not his last. In 79, he began robbing stores with a mask to cover his face. Dani had always been violent and unable to control his impulses. Yes, but towards the end of the 70s and throughout the 80s. Didn't he have any intention of stopping them or remorse for what he was doing? During that time, he practically didn't work. Instead, he sustained himself through the thefts he was committing, in addition to other more minor crimes. During those years, he faced legal issues and was accused of various crimes in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. He escaped from prison multiple times. One of those times was when he asked for permission to go to the bathroom and was working in a forest. The guards gave him permission and he simply ran off, but he didn't get very far before he was found. They made most of their escapes. He just looked for any kind of distraction and left. He didn't dwell on it too much. Daniel had to serve the rest of his sentence. By 1985, he was again arrested for several armed robberies, something he excused by saying he was hungry. He stole because he hadn't eaten for 2 days. In 1986, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. That same year, in April, he escaped from prison by swimming through the Snake River, but was found just 6 days later. After internal debates and frequent changes, they decided to put him in solitary confinement. He served 3 of the 4 years he was sentenced to and was released on parole. I don't know if anyone could have guessed the crimes he would commit later with just the information they had about him at that time. Although he was an escape artist, a person who definitely, if it was in his hands, would not stay in prison, he had not yet shown so much violence, at least there was no record of it. Clearly, his stay in prison did not reform him. Far from it, he became even more unstable. Consider that for 8 months of confinement he was not able to talk to anyone. The important thing is that they had just made one of the worst mistakes they could have possibly made. They released who would be the Gainesville Ripper. One of his girlfriends finally made him go talk to a psychiatrist, as it was evident that he had unresolved issues with his father, who seemed to hate him, while Daniel wanted with all his being to become someone and earn the respect of this man. That is, he also hated him for everything he had done to him, but he also needed him to recognize him. In 1990, he had a car accident during a heavy storm and was thrown from the vehicle, hitting his head. After his visit to the hospital, he decided to start spying on houses again, then to enter them until he started stealing and eventually sexually abusing women. He would go after them with his face covered, a knife, and adhesive tape. That's where his modus operandi started. Around that time, no job lasted, as he was either fired or he resigned. The most violent episode was in 1990, when, without a job or a place to live, he returned to his parents' house. In May, he entered the kitchen and started tying his shoelaces, when his father started yelling at him for putting his foot on a stool to do it. Provoking him, Daniel asked him what he would do to stop him. So the man went to fetch his gun in a frenzy and pointed it at him. Daniel said he threw himself in front of his father to protect his mother, as his father had threatened to kill them both. At that moment, the father shoots him twice, but he responds with his own gun, firing 3 shots, hitting him with 2 bullets, one in the stomach and another between the eyebrows. Sure that he had killed his father, he decided to escape, but before that, he decided to break into the house of a couple with whom he had a good relationship. Surprised that he came in drunk and with a weapon in hand, they asked him what he was doing and he began to try to rob them. The couple would later declare that it seemed like they were talking to 2 different people, as at times he was calm and sad, but at other times he seemed extremely angry. Daniel needed money to escape or for someone to take him to Dallas. After back and forth, they convinced him to call the hospital to see if he had really killed his father. There he learned that while he was in critical condition, he hadn't died. A bit more calm, the couple offers him about $30, some cookies, and an apple. They give him a coat for the night, and Daniel finally becomes a fugitive again. As for the father, James Rowling, he lost an eye and could never hear again from one ear, but he lived. He also later accused his son of attempted murder. To avoid being caught, Danny stole from a house in his city where he took identity documents with which he posed as Michael Kennedy Jr. Under this name, he left his hometown and in July of 1990 settled in Florida. And if you're thinking for a second that this could have served to straighten his life, let me tell you it was just the opposite. At that moment, he became obsessed with killing. Officially, Daniel was charged with the first-degree murder of 5 people on November 15, 1991. And since then, he was sent to the Florida State Prison awaiting trial for those charges, and serving the sentence that was previously imposed on him for the robberies he had committed. Even though, as I tell you, the evidence was mostly based on his record and blood type, Daniel nonetheless confessed to the murders. Let's start with what he stated about the Julie Grissom case. He said on a cloudy night in Shreveport, Louisiana, around 10 post-meridium, "I rode my yellow bike through the field behind the Grissom's house. I left the bike and jumped the fence into their backyard." Mr. Grissom had been making a barbecue in his rear Porsche while his grandson Sean Grissom was coming home. Mr. Tom Grissom had left the back door open and I barged into the living room. He was wearing camouflage pants, jungle boots, a black t-shirt, a kabar knife hanging from an improvised holster, leather gloves, a .38 caliber revolver, and a mask. I ordered the Grissoms to lie on the floor. Then I handcuffed Mr. Tom Grissom behind his back and sealed his mouth with adhesive tape. Afterwards, I went to Mrs. Julie Grissom, taped her hands behind her back, and taped her mouth shut. Then I did the same to little Sean Grissom. I took Mr. Tom Grissom from the living room to the utility room next to the washer and dryer and stabbed him twice. first in the right kidney, then the second time under the sternum, stabbing the knife into the heart. The next thing he confessed to were the murders of the students. Daniel had been spying on two girls for a while, as was his custom, until he decided to attack. He entered the apartment shared by Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, who were 18 and 17 years old respectively. Both girls were stabbed countless times and their bodies mutilated, according to statements made by Danny himself. Afterwards, the first one he attacked was Sonia, who was sleeping in her room. The first thing he did was stab her in the chest, but not fatally. When Sonia woke up, he taped her mouth shut to prevent her calls for help from waking Christina, who was sleeping in the living room. Sonia died after a minute of struggle. She was aware of what was happening, but had no way to defend herself or alert her companion of what was happening. Once he had killed her, Daniel went down and repeated the process, covering Christina's mouth with tape and tying her hands, but before stabbing her, he sexually abused her. After doing so, he forced her to lie on her stomach, that is, face down, and stabbed her 5 times in the back. In addition to the sexual abuse, while still alive, Christina Dani abused both her body and Sonia's, also leaving them in strange positions. The second attack happened approximately 24 hours later, on Sunday, August 25 of 1990, when he repeated what he had done the night before, entering the apartment of another student, located just 3 kilometers from where he had committed the first homicides. To access the place, he broke the glass door. There was no one inside. So, armed with a hunting knife and an automatic pistol, Danny waited until around 23 hours, when Krista Hoyt returned home. Just like with the previous victims, Danny gagged her with duct tape, and after tying her hands at knife point, he led her to a room where he abused her. Repeating the same modus operandi as before, he repeatedly stabbed her until he took her life, again abusing her body. Just over a day later, on August 27th, Danny attacked again, this time at 3 in the morning. The modus operandi was the same. He went into a third apartment occupied by university students. Manuel Taboada and Tracy Pulse lived here. Upon entering, he found Manuel, or Manny as his friends called him, sleeping, and without hesitation attacked him by stabbing him in the chest and waking him up. Confused by the situation, Manny tried to defend himself but was stabbed by Daniel, also in his arms, hands, legs, and face, until he finally succeeded in taking his life. Awoken by the commotion, Tracy approached her roommate's room. When she realized what was happening, she ran back to her room where she tried to lock herself in, but this didn't manage to save her. Daniel forced the door open and entered. Just like with the previous victims, he gagged and tied her to sexually abuse her and to take her life. In the confession with the prosecution, Danny stated that within him existed multiple personalities, 2 of which were especially dark. Enad, Danny written backwards, and Gemini. According to him, Enad was bad but not capable of murder, but Gemini was. He said he was sinister and readily blamed the other person for the crimes. The mental health professionals who treated him didn't believe any of this and took that story as a desperate attempt to absolve himself of guilt. Anyway, Danny had confessed. In his confession, he made it clear that he had worked alone, and thus all the charges that had been put on Ed Humphrey were dropped, who was released 10 months after the attack on his grandmother. Daniel's trial began almost 4 years after he murdered the 5 students, on February 5, 1994. There he pleaded guilty to all charges, facing a death sentence, which his defense sought to avoid, arguing that his behavior originated from childhood traumas. However, they were unsuccessful, and he was indeed sentenced by the jury to 5 death penalties, and the judge agreed Danny would be executed. As we have already seen in other cases, death penalties are not something that is done immediately, as they follow a long process of appeals, judicial reviews, and so on. What is known as death row. Danny spent more than 20 years in this. She was executed by lethal injection on October 25, 2006. Meanwhile, it was revealed that the murderer had her own internet page where she published a series of gothic tales, which she called Black Swamp Legends. And she was selling The Making of a Serial Killer, the book where she recounted her experiences. She said, "I am guilty only as Gemini, a bloodthirsty being, but as the person I am, I feel deep remorse." Before her execution, she stared at the mother of one of her victims and sang a verse from a hymn. No one greater than you, Lord, no one greater than you. Her last wish was to eat lobster tail, shrimp, baked potatoes, cheesecake with strawberries, and sweet tea. Today, a mural at the University of Florida in Gainesville commemorates the victims. And she promises that she will never go back to something like that again. I had to put on my glasses because my eyes got tired. People with astigmatism will understand me. It's a pain to have one eye that understands more than the other, but well, I hope the glare doesn't bother. Anyway, we're done. That was all I had to say for the video. Tell me what you think below in the comments. You likely know about this case, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Have you covered it yet? Have you done this case yet? If not, has it been done on the channel? No, because I deleted it. Why haven't I deleted it yet? I'm going to delete it now because I did it for Halloween a year ago. I think I did something similar a year or two ago, but it lasted 12 minutes. When I saw that, I said, actually, that's a too concise way to tell this because it wasn't like that. I found it very uninteresting and as if it was missing many things, so I decided to do it again. But better edition. Also, it's like the previous video seemed too quick to make because... yes, instead of actually being interested in the story, it's like I did it, in my opinion, very poorly. I enjoy redoing things this way, but there's always a need for clarification. If you ever have any questions, I always clarify it somewhere, either in the title or in the video itself. If I don't clarify, I won't redo it. You're likely confusing me with someone else. Because it often happens to me that someone comments or several people comment, I think you've already made this video. No, I didn't make this video, but I did remake this one. We also need to check if anyone still remembers that video. Seriously, I think it lasted 12 minutes. You can't explain anything in that time, in my opinion. So tell me what you think. If you remembered or if you knew the story, which is supposed to be the origin of Scream. If you want to recommend cases for me to cover on the channel, my email is in the description below, in the description of all the videos. And another thing, if you want to see the videos earlier, you can become members of the channel. Down below where it says subscribe or join, you can see more details. So well, we have come this far with the case. Here are the Patreon and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through these means. And without further ado, here you have a new video here. Here you have a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video. Goodbye.